Okay, we're ready to start our study of the digestive system. The digestive system consists pretty much of a tube, and here on the screen we have a drawing of the digestive system. We know it starts with the mouth, the oral cavity here, so you go from the mouth into the region we know is the pharynx. The pharynx leads into the elongated esophagus. It goes down to the stomach, down in the abdominal cavity. And the stomach leads into the small intestine, which snakes all around in here, lots of loops and turns in the small intestine, and eventually leads into the large intestine on the lower right quadrant of the abdominal cavity here. So it leads into the large intestine here. The large intestine goes up and across and down and eventually out. So anyway, those are the primary tubular passages of the digestive system. We also refer to this as the alimentary canal or the GI tract. Some other terms used there for the digestive system. So we're going to go through this in a sequential way. We're also going to introduce some other parts. Let's go to those next. Here we have the same diagram, but in this diagram we put in the salivary glands, parotid gland there on the side of the head, sublingual under the tongue, and then the submandibular gland. So we have those glands in there. And then also, these are all, by the way, outgrowths of the digestive system. The liver, the gallbladder, and pancreas, also outgrowths of the digestive system. We'll look at how that happens in a little more detail later on. So when we study the digestive system, those are the primary things we'll be looking at. Oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, pancreas. Here's the oral cavity, and by the way, these are drawings from the Comparative Anatomy website. So I'm just looking at the website on the big screen television here. And these are the things we want you to know about the oral cavity. First of all, the oral cavity, also known as the buccal cavity, another name for it, extends from, of course, your lips inward to an opening to your pharynx in the back we know as the fauces. So anyway, all of that is oral cavity. Just inside, well, first of all, the lips are also referred to as labia, superior labium and inferior labium, upper lip, superior lip, and inferior lip. Okay? Just inside of the lip and inside of the gum line, between the lip and the gum and between the cheek and the gum in there, we have a space called the oral vestibule. The oral vestibule, that space kind of outside of your teeth and gums, but still inside your mouth, inside the lip and cheek. The oral vestibule. In that oral vestibule, there's a tag of tissue that connects the middle of your lip to the middle of the front of your jaw, right there, the gum line right in the middle. It's called the superior labial frenulum. Superior labial frenulum. If you pull your lip out, you'll notice that that's a place where the tissue stretches very tight, makes a tight little tag of connection between the gum and the lip. Same thing is true on the lower lip. There's an inferior labial frenulum connecting your lower lip to your gum line there. The tongue is something that everybody knows. Underneath of the tongue, there's a connection of the tongue to the floor of the mouth known as the lingual frenulum. The lingual frenulum. The roof of the mouth is known as the palate, and there's a hard palate portion in the front, backed by bone. Our maxilla and palatine bone support the palate, the hard palate, and then behind the hard palate is a region of soft palate, and it is supported by skeletal muscle. There's skeletal muscle there. Hanging down from the very back of the soft palate is the uvula. The uvula hanging down right in the middle of that space known as the fauces. To either side of the fauces, here, that opening to the pharynx, we have what are called palatoglossal arches. Palatoglossal arches. Now, just behind those palatoglossal arches on each side is where you would find your tonsils, would be just behind that there. not labeled in this diagram, but right up here in the front are a couple of dots that represent the openings to the submandibular glands. They come up right to the base of the lingual frenulum, and then some smaller dots right behind that that are openings to the sublingual ducts from the sublingual gland, salivary ducts there. Your parotid gland, the other salivary gland on the side of your head, has ducts that are not shown here on the illustration, but they'd come in next to your second molar right here in the oral vestibule, into the oral vestibule adjacent to your second molar. So those are parts of the mouth, the oral cavity or buccal cavity. We should identify our tooth types, I should say, as we go into studying the digestive system as well. Most of us know these names for our different teeth. The incisors, there are 2 on one side above, 2 on the other side above, and the same thing down on the lower jaw. 2 on one side and 2 on the other. Canine is next. There's 1 canine on each side of the upper jaw, 1 on each side of the lower jaw. That's followed by premolars. You have a couple of premolars on each side on the upper jaw, a couple of premolars on each side on the lower jaw. So there's a lot of symmetry between the upper jaw and the lower jaw in humans. Molars, we've got 3 molars on each side of the upper jaw. We have 3 molars on each side of the lower jaw. Most people have their wisdom teeth, that third molar, removed. So it varies from individual to individual. All right, here's a tooth, the anatomy of a tooth. A little later we'll look at the developmental anatomy of a tooth, how a tooth develops in the jawline and forms the mature tooth. But anyway, in the mature tooth, we have a region we know is the crown of the tooth that sticks up above the gum line. A short section we know as the neck, where there's still some enamel over the tooth and it's still above the bone there. And then below that is the root of the tooth, no longer covered by enamel and set into the bone of the jaw down there at the root. The covering on the outside is the enamel, the blue layer we have right here, very hard material, as we know, the outer covering of the tooth. Below that is a layer of dentin in yellow, seen here. The dentin is a little more like bone tissue than is the enamel, although they have a lot of the same kind of minerals involved in the construction of both the enamel and the dentin. There are no cells in the enamel at all, no processes of cells, and less of the organic material that you might find in the dentin material. In the middle of a tooth, you have a pulp cavity. In that would be connective tissue, blood vessels, nerves. Gingiva, I don't think I used that term earlier, but anyway, that's the name for the gums, the gingiva. Surrounding the dentin down here in the root of the tooth, there's a layer known as cementum, a special layer of bony material called cementum. And then between that cementum and the bone, outside that, there's a layer of collagen, connective tissue, called the periodontal ligament. Periodontal ligament. So that joins the tooth to the bone, that periodontal ligament there. So those are the parts of a mature tooth. We're going to look at a couple of illustrations now from the website that show the beginnings of a tooth and how a tooth develops down under the gum line. We begin with just a layer of epidermis covering just an epithelial layer that lies over the top of the embryonic jaw. And during development of the embryonic jaw, we start to form right along the middle of that ridge, right at the very top. We initiate some tooth buds. So this is the beginning of a tooth bud, and here it is a little better formed in the next view. And it has a little tag that comes down from the top, and then it spreads out to form what's called an enamel organ above the developing bone of the jaw here. So at first we have a tooth bud that forms an enamel organ. Next, we have some changes that occur in this enamel organ. You can see the bone forming around what will eventually be the root down here. But we have cells that are just inside this upside down cup shape right here that start forming enamel. Those are called ameloblasts, A-M-E-L-O-B-L-A-S-T-S, ameloblasts. This entire structure here was called the enamel organ, as we identified earlier. So that enamel organ is starting to make some enamel from those ameloblasts. The cells down here that form the dentin are called odontoblasts. Odontoblasts. So we have that odontoblast forming dentin from below, ameloblasts forming enamel from above. Eventually, those odontoblasts will continue on down here into the root of the tooth, and the bone will grow up, and the tooth will be pushed up as it develops, and this entire enamel organ will be lost along with the ameloblast cells, so that all the enamel covered portion of the tooth, the upper part of the tooth there, all that will be lost, and enamel will be the only thing left on the outside in the final analysis. Which leads us back to the ordinary tooth down here. So there's still a layer on the inside of this dentin that produces dentin. Those odontoblast cells are all still there. The ameloblast cells that form the enamel are all gone. That enamel organ is no longer present because we pushed the tooth up and all the enamel is exposed, but the root remains alive down here. We still have connective tissue and blood vessels and nerves and everything in the core of that tooth. Okay, here's the drawing of salivary gland locations. I never have liked my drawing very well here of the face. Not too good at drawing faces. But anyway, a while back somebody on Jeopardy, a contestant on Jeopardy, I saw them and I thought that's exactly like the drawing I made for my salivary glands. But anyway, the parotid gland sits here in front of the ear along the side of the jaw, the mandible right there. And the duct from that parotid gland leads across the masseter muscle and enters the mouth, like we said, just next to the second molar up there in the oral vestibule. Submandibular glands, there's two of them, one on each side underneath the corner, the back corner or angle of the jaw, the back angle of the jaw. So just inside the angle of the jaw, and it has a duct that leads up, and we saw where that came into the mouth to either side of the lingual frenulum. And then finally the sublingual glands that are underneath the tongue, they kind of all join together in there, and they have ducts that lead up to the left and the right. Just behind the opening of the submandibular gland, there are multiple openings of the sublingual gland in there. In addition to these named salivary glands, parotid, submandibular, and sublingual, your mouth is full of minor salivary glands. There's glands in your tongue, there are glands in your gums and palate. So all around inside your mouth there are minor salivary glands that produce saliva in addition to your named salivary glands. All right, here's a view of the three regions of the pharynx: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. In the front here we have the opening to the nasal cavity. This is nasal cavity here, and then there's oral cavity right here, separated by the palate right across here. So embryonically, these are common spaces. They're not divided by the palate, so we'll look later at the changes that occur in the formation of the face and mouth to form that separation. So our respiratory passages, our nasal passages here become separated from the oral cavity. But anyway, back in the back of the mouth, what you see when you look in the back of the mouth is that oropharynx. It's below the level of your soft palate and above that's a little tag sticking up right here. That is the epiglottis. So above the epiglottis and below the soft palate right in there, you see the oropharynx. Up above your soft palate, all the way up to the vomer bone would form that line right across there, you have the nasopharynx. And in front of the nasopharynx, you have that nasal septum that divides the left and right nasal cavity. Behind your vomer, you have a common cavity there, that nasopharynx. Down below here, once you get to your epiglottis and the opening to your windpipe or trachea or larynx right there, that is called the glottis opening. So next to your epiglottis and glottis is the laryngopharynx above your esophagus. So you've got an esophagus here, a trachea, a larynx here, the glottis opening there, and the epiglottis right there. Okay. So those are your three regions of the pharynx. In the digestive process, we know that our mouth does the chewing of the food, so it starts a mechanical kind of breakdown of your food. The saliva starts a chemical breakdown of your food, so the salivary glands contribute to your chemical digestion. And when you swallow, your tongue and oral cavity muscles, they work to push the food back into the pharynx. And the pharynx, even though it's a skeletal muscle primarily in your pharynx, it begins a reflex of swallowing. The reflex of swallowing, and pushes the food down into the esophagus. It raises the larynx up against the epiglottis so that you won't have food coming into the glottis when you swallow. That's all kind of a reflexive behavior once you get the food back into the pharynx, that swallowing. So the pharynx itself does not contribute to the digestive process, but just serves to move by the swallowing reflex. It moves the food into the esophagus. I've tried to recreate the drawing from the website here on the board to illustrate some of the other features associated with the pharynx. Remember that our vomer right about here is going to separate our nasal passages. Our entire nasal septum runs through here, but our vomer is right here at the back of that nasal septum that divides the two nasal passages. So beyond that, we had the portion we know as nasopharynx there. Then we had beyond the palatoglossal arch, which would be about right here, down to the epiglottis, we had the oropharynx, and then right about here we had the opening to the glottis and the opening to the esophagus. So that sets up our third division, our laryngopharynx right here. So we have nasopharynx, oropharynx, pharynx, and laryngopharynx in there. So let's go ahead and label some other things in this drawing. Up here in the very top of the nasopharynx, there's an opening, and I need a different color to show that. Right in there, there's an opening to the eustachian tube. So eustachian tube. Eustachian tube opening right there. It's not on my screen, is it? Adjacent to the eustachian tube opening there in the roof of the nasopharynx, there is a special kind of tonsil we usually refer to as an adenoid. There's a pair of them, they're adenoids, and they are also known as pharyngeal tonsils. pharyngeal tonsils. So those are the main features of the nasopharynx region. Next, down in the oropharynx, about the only feature in here is another tonsil, and this time it's going to be our palatine tonsil. Usually when you hear about somebody needing their tonsils removed, it's your palatine tonsil that is being taken out there. Then we've already mentioned the structure that sticks up in here right there. It's called the epiglottis. It's just a cartilaginous flap that will cover the opening to the larynx when you swallow. And that opening right there is called the glottis, G-L-O-T-T-I-S, the glottis. So we have nasal cavities up above, we have oral cavities out in front, we have the esophagus. Running down here, we have the larynx. Here, and the trachea, right here. So those are things associated with the pharyngeal region. And remember, the pharynx doesn't have any role in secreting enzymes for digestion or mechanical breakdown of the food for digestion. It just moves the food from the mouth to the esophagus.